Okay, so we're on to lesson 6, where we're going to record a cash purchases transaction. Alright, so this transaction says on the 25th of January 2016, the business bought goods for cash, $3,000. Now, same thing, the first thing we're going to do is identify the two accounts that are affected by this transaction. One is bought goods and cash. And we, from the asset of stock lecture, we know that once we buy goods, the account that is affected is purchases account, and the other account that is affected is the cash account. The next thing we're going to do is determine the categories of accounts that these belong to. We know by now that cash is an asset, and purchases. Do you remember what type of account purchases is? When did we discuss purchases? Under which category? Well, let me remind you. Purchases is the most important expense in a business. So purchases is an expense. Alright, right away your head should be bubbling with the double entry rules for assets and for expenses, but remember that they have the same rules. To increase, we debit, and to decrease, we credit. So we're buying goods for cash. When we buy goods, do we increase our purchases expense? Yes, we do. The more we buy is the more our purchases expense is. To increase an expense, you debit. So we debit the purchases account. So January 25, it's for cash that we're buying goods, and the amount is $3,000. And then cash. When we buy goods for cash, do we spend cash or do we get cash? Do we increase cash or we decrease cash? We decrease cash. Cash is an asset. To decrease an asset, we credit. So we credit the cash account because this transaction is decreasing our cash. So we say January 25, we bought goods. That's what purchases means, of an amount $3,000. Remember, there's another reason why the purchases account is debited. Remember that purchases also increases inventory. Remember that purchases increases inventory. Alright, so when we buy stock, we increase the amount of inventory we have on hand. Inventory is an asset. And to increase an asset, you debit. So when we buy stock, we debit purchases for two reasons. One is an expense. To increase an expense, you debit. And when we purchase goods, we also increase asset. And to increase asset, we debit. The double entry rules do not contradict each other. They all work in the same way. Alright? So as long as you're okay with this, we'll move on to our next lecture, which is credit purchases. Toodles!